The railways transformed Britain. From town to town and city to city, the tracks spread. They changed the way we live forever. But there was a darker side to the advent of the railways. This technological revolution offered new opportunities for the oldest of crimes. In this series, we'll be investigating the most notorious murders ever to take place on the British railways. Stories of the men who killed, of the police who hunted them, and of the victims who were left behind. From the files of Scotland Yard and the railway police, this is the history of blood on the tracks of Britain. The 9th of July, 1864. It was 10:10 in the evening and a train was readying for departure from Hackney Station in East London. Two bank clerks with first-class tickets had just taken seats in the compartment nearest the engine. But as the young men sat down, they realized something was very wrong. The cushions and walls were splattered with blood. A black leather bag lay open on a seat. On the floor was a man's cane topped with a heavy ivory knob. And beside it, a crumpled top hat. Whatever had happened in that first-class compartment had been violent, but no one had heard any cries for help and there was no report of a disturbance. The victim and his attacker had vanished.
It caused quite a shock. It was a big sensation at the time. It did put into people's minds doubts about the safety of the railways.
It disturbs the complacency that had surrounded railway travel in a way that leads us to think a great deal about the impact of technology and assumptions about how positive it is.
It showed that this new way of travelling was not necessarily safe. You could be stuck in a sealed compartment and come to a very sticky end.
The railways were the technological icon of the 19th century. The first public railway powered by steam opened in 1830. It linked the industrial powerhouse of Manchester with the port at Liverpool, and it was intended to carry mostly freight. But passenger demand quickly exceeded all expectations. Until then, a stagecoach had been the fastest form of public transport. It could cover 8 miles in an hour. The Liverpool and Manchester railway trains could cover 17 miles in an hour. And they were not only twice as fast as a stagecoach, the tickets were half the price. The new railway was hugely popular and profitable. Investors and businessmen quickly saw the potential. Britain was seized by a railway mania. New lines stretched out across the country.
It was probably the most momentous innovation since the invention of agriculture at the end of the Stone Age.
Lots of different railway companies, privately financed by and large, and not always particularly well coordinated. They would choose a route which they thought was going to give them most commercial advantage.
There were a number of minor rail companies, but these gradually became amalgamated until sort of by the 1860s, you had something like about 5,000 miles of track.
The pace of change was staggering. By 1864, nearly every major town and city in Britain was linked by a sprawling network of railway tracks. These iron roads sliced through hills and forests. They spanned rivers and valleys. They were even beginning to burrow beneath the earth.
It transformed not just the scenery, but the culture as well. Everything seemed like it was going to take place at high speed, and people's sense of time became standardized.
Trains had to keep railway time, so you, the passengers, the users of the railway, you had to keep railway time too.
It transformed people's sense of space, the whole world seeming much more connected in a way that we can compare to the internet today. If you were born at the end of this revolution, it would have been hard to imagine what it was like to live without the railway.
Passengers flocked to the railways in their thousands. The working population of Britain was on the move as never before. But alongside that excitement, this technological innovation also provoked fears. Could the human body cope with such speeds? Would society, with all its traditional bonds and hierarchies, survive this steam-powered revolution?
Victorian society was highly stratified. The class system was just embedded into everything. There were worries with the railways that there would be a sort of rather social promiscuity, the mixing. You know, the baronet might have to sit next to a baker or a boot blackener or a butcher.
People were confined to individual compartments, so people weren't quite sure who was going to get on at the next station and share a compartment with them.
It worried the Victorians that there were these opportunities for the criminal classes, the roughs, to have an easier access to the respectable middle and upper classes, to respectable women, to make themselves nuisances in a way that, if they were simply on foot, they couldn't do.
So people frequently hid their bags or gripped their stick, ready to beat off an attack. So there was this fear, this uncertainty about travelling in a railway carriage.
Such things didn't worry Mr. Thomas Briggs. In 1864, the 69-year-old banker had an annual season ticket for the North London Railway.
The North London Railway did not run third-class carriages in 1864. Because it served the city, Fenchurch Street, through to the newly expanding middle-class suburbs, Hackney, Chalk Farm, the idea was that it would pass through the working class areas, but not stop in them. So they only provided carriages for second class and first class passengers.
Thomas Briggs was a very well-to-do and quite sort of wealthy man, actually. He was the chief cashier at a bank in the city.
This is a gentleman who has really pretty much got to the upper echelons of the middle classes. You couldn't go higher than he had risen without becoming a partner.
Briggs took the train almost every day, journeying between his home in Hackney and his office at Robarts Curtis Bank in the city. The 9th of July was no different. It was a Saturday, but Briggs was still expected at the office. At 3 p.m. after work, He took an omnibus across London Bridge to pay one of his regular visits to his niece in Peckham. He had dinner with Caroline and her husband, and it was still light when he left at around 8:30. He reached Fenchurch Street Station in time for the 9:45 train. He cheerfully bid the ticket collector good night, then with his cane and his black leather bag in hand, Thomas Briggs clambered into the first-class compartment nearest the engine. A few minutes later, the train was on the move. The empty and bloodied first-class compartment found at Hackney Station was sealed off. Then the train departed just a few minutes late. Police would soon meet it at Chalk Farm, its final stop. By then, another grim discovery had been made. An empty train was returning to Bow Station when its driver spotted something between the tracks. He stopped his engine and sent the stoker and guard out to investigate. And lying on the gravel was the twisted, black-clad body of a man. Thomas Briggs was unconscious, but still alive.
The train driver and the conductor called for help from a nearby pub, and men came out onto the track to help him, and a police officer came from K Division, which was Stepney at the time, and the Metropolitan Police. And they took him to the pub, looked after him, and called the doctor to him.
His head was terribly injured from him either falling, jumping, or being pushed out of the railway carriage at some speed. He also had abrasions and bruises on his hands and his lower arms, which suggest that he had been fighting at least one assailant.
When the doctors looked at the injuries, they thought that one of the head injuries might have been from when he fell onto the tracks, but also they realised that other injuries were caused by a blunt instrument and he had been assaulted.
His wounds were severe. His skull had been caved in. A deep, jagged cut almost sliced his ear clean off. His white beard was stained scarlet with blood. Briggs was identified from letters found in his coat pocket. They carried him first to a nearby pub, and then to his home, a fine Regency townhouse in a Hackney Garden Square. And there, late on the 10th of July, Thomas Briggs died. The Monday papers were full of news of the attack. Briggs had been a gentleman, chief clerk at the Robarts Curtis Bank, the embodiment of Victorian middle-class affluence and respectability. And he had been murdered while a passenger on the great technological innovation of the age.
It was a complete threat to sort of established norms. This was the first time that somebody had been murdered in a railway train.
A train like that should have been secure. It should have been a safe environment. That it should have happened in a first-class carriage was particularly shocking.
It gave the sense, if you could be slaughtered in a train carriage, then why not in a church pew, or why not at your workplace?
It attacked the guardians of the respectability that made Britain and the British Empire great.
Scotland Yard Police Commissioner Sir Richard Mayne appointed one of his best men to the investigation. Detective Inspector Richard Tanner was just 31 years old and newly promoted, but he was well respected for his hard work and keen eye for the crucial lead. The family of Thomas Briggs had identified the cane and the black leather bag found in the compartment. They had belonged to the slain man. But the hat? Briggs wore a silk top hat made by expert craftsmen in the City of London. His family didn't recognize the crumpled beaver hat at all.
It's an almost sort of Cluedo-like touch, you know, the crumpled hat in the train compartment.
It was not a hat that a man of Mr. Briggs's status, responsibility, his standing would have dreamt of wearing.
Thomas Briggs bought his hats at a guinea a time from a hatter in the City of London. They were silk top hats. This was different.
This beaver hat that was found was only about 8 and sixpence or 10 and sixpence in actually price. It was a much cheaper hat than Mr. Briggs's normal hat.
Find the owner of the crumpled top hat, and Inspector Tanner would find the killer. He soon got an early breakthrough. Thomas Briggs had owned a heavy, old-fashioned watch with a gold case and chain, but it was missing after the attack. A description of it was circulated to the newspapers, where it was seen by jeweller John Death. Death claimed a gold chain, like the one belonging to Thomas Briggs, had been exchanged in his shop on the Monday after the murder. The customer had been a young, clean-shaven man with a foreign accent. He had picked out a cheaper, more modern chain, as well as a signet ring. Death had packed the chain in a small cardboard box, stamped with his shop's address.
John Death had never seen the young man before, and he described him as about 30. He thought he was German, and he noticed that all the time that he was sort of valuing the chain, the young man was sort of turning this way and that, so as to stop a really clear impression being taken of him.
They would have been used to somebody being slightly embarrassed by the need to undertake such a transaction. So for him to remain in the shadows would not have been difficult and not automatically suspect. But it's an unusual enough transaction to account for Death's remembering him. For him to have chosen to exchange the watch chain for something that was inferior, the gap was not enough. It's a 5-shilling gap between the cost of the chain that he chose in exchange. If it had been £1, £2, that would have been understandable and probably forgotten. But it's strange.
The police took away the heavy, old-fashioned chain as evidence. It was quickly identified as belonging to Thomas Briggs. Inspector Tanner now had a possible suspect, but he had no name and only the vaguest of descriptions. He needed more. Thomas Briggs' employers at the Robarts Curtis Bank put up £100 as a reward for information. The government matched it, as did the North London Railway Company. Posters were plastered across the capital. But days passed with no further breakthrough. Tanner knew with each day that passed, the crime was less likely to be solved. His investigation was in trouble.
They had failed to come up with a solution to a murder that had caused national, not just local, panic. The newspapers were demanding to know why the detective police were so failing to solve this crime.
London was a multicultural city. It had always embraced immigrants. The presence of a German wasn't in and of itself particularly strange. It certainly wouldn't have flagged up, oh, he's probably a murderer, what on earth was a German doing?
It left the police still looking for a needle in a haystack.
By the 18th of July, almost 10 days had passed since the murder of Thomas Briggs. The victim had been buried, but the case was far from solved. Then, at 11:15 that evening, a man walked into a police station in Marylebone and reignited the hunt for the killer. Jonathan Matthews was a Hackney carriage driver. He told police that on the Monday after the murder, a young German friend had paid him a call. His name was Franz Müller. He was 23, a tailor, who was particularly fond of his black beaver hat. As they spoke, Müller had given Matthew's daughter a box to play with, and printed on the lid was the name and address of the jeweller, John Death.
This was the big breakthrough.
The police, who were under huge pressure to come up with a solution, have something.
Yes, the box had come from the jeweller's shop. Yes, the chain and the ring had been placed in the box. But best of all, Matthews was even able to provide a photograph. This really opened up the case now.
Tanner had his lead at last. There was just one problem. The reason Franz Müller had visited Jonathan Matthews. He'd come to say goodbye before leaving for America. In 1864, the Grinnell and Company shipping line offered some of the cheapest fares to America, and it wasn't hard to see why. The Victoria was an old-fashioned sailing ship. Steerage passengers paid just £4 to cross the Atlantic, but their quarters were cramped and uncomfortable. They had to prepare their own meals, and the passage would take 19 days, if they were lucky. Among the passengers enjoying the Victoria's meagre comforts in July 1864 was a young tailor. He was leaving his troubles behind, he thought, heading for a new start in the new world.
We know that he comes from Thuringia in Germany, and that relatively few people from that region, and indeed from his background, came to the UK.
Franz Müller had come over to London. He was known as quite a polite young man. He hadn't caused any problems. He wasn't a violent man.
The records we have from his friends suggest that he was always trying to improve his own clothing to get a more fashionable angle to coat or waistcoat or trousers.
He was employed as a tailor, and in the weeks before he went to America, he was actually earning about 25 shillings a week.
He had a certain amount of pretensions and would tell people that he was going over to America, where he was going to be earning £150 a year, paid for by his employers. Well, that wasn't actually true, but nevertheless, he was keen to do well, he was ambitious, and he wanted to go to America.
Müller's journey to New York was even slower than expected. The winds were against them. After more than 2 weeks at sea, the Victoria had barely escaped the coast of Ireland. The vast Atlantic still lay ahead. Müller passed the time gambling. He lost a bet over how much German sausage he could eat. He sold off his shirts to pay debts. But he betrayed no concern over what he'd left behind in London. If he feared the police were after him, the other passengers didn't notice. All Müller had to do was get to America. Once he was there, he must have thought he would be free.
The situation in America was pretty dramatic because America was in the third year of the Civil War.
There was, as a result, a considerable need for fighting men. All that Franz Muller would have needed to do to disappear was join up under whatever name came to his head.
There's every chance he could have become anonymous, melted into the crowd. It was a huge, huge, huge country, and its systems of police tracking were much more effective in the big cities than they were elsewhere. So if he'd reached those shores first, then I'm not sure he would ever have been caught and brought to justice.
As the Victoria struggled across the Atlantic, in London, Detective Inspector Richard Tanner was in a race against time. If he planned to arrest Muller in America and bring him back, Tanner would need an extradition agreement, and to get that, he needed more evidence.
He knew that to have an extradition hearing, he would have to prove the case to the satisfaction of the American authorities. And in those days, extradition proceedings were in their infancy, and they were always difficult.
It was going to be a matter of very careful preparation, very careful negotiation in order for the extradition to be granted.
So Tanner is caught in a really tense race against time because Muller is bobbing across the Atlantic Ocean very slowly in his boat, the Victoria. And Tanner's aware he's got to compile all this evidence that can present a watertight case, and he's also got to make sure that the extradition process is going to be effective at the other end.
Armed with the photograph of Muller, Inspector Tanner hurried once more to the jeweller John Death. Death confirmed it. That was definitely the man who had come into his shop to exchange the gold watch chain. Tanner rushed all over London. He spoke to Muller's landlady, his friend, his employer. He was building up a sketch of a vain and boastful young man, a young man desperate for money to cross the Atlantic. A young man who, shortly after the murder of Thomas Briggs, was seen with a fine new top hat.
The inquiries showed that Franz Muller had actually bought a ticket at London docks on the Tuesday of that week, and he'd set sail on the Thursday. But Jonathan Matthews had told the police just too late for Franz Muller to have been caught whilst he was still in London.
Suddenly the case acquired a great urgency, and the hunt for Muller began.
The witnesses were hurried to Bow Street Magistrates' Court. Depositions were taken and the evidence heard. By 6 o'clock on the 19th of July, a warrant had been issued for Muller's arrest. Tanner had gathered everything he could. There was no more time. Late that evening, the exhausted inspector boarded an express train bound for Liverpool. With him were Detective Sergeant George Clark, the jeweller John Death, and the cabman Jonathan Matthews. They had tickets booked on a fast transatlantic steamer leaving the next morning.
There was no other way of contacting America. The undersea cable would be another year, 18 months before that was in position.
There was no alternative, but he had to go himself, and he had to get there before the Victoria landed.
The huge advantage that the British had was that they could use the expensive means of travelling using a steam-powered vessel rather than a sailing vessel.
Tanner arrived in New York on the 5th of August. Muller may have had a 5-day head start, but Tanner reached America first. The police inspector was relieved. There was still much for him to do.
New York City was very much unlike, our association of it with these soaring metallic skyscrapers. It was low rise in those days, and you had pigs galloping through the streets. It was still very much embryonic.
The American Civil War had been going on for 3 or 4 years at the time. Britain was accused of taking sides in favour of the South, or that was the perception in New York.
Now, there was no extradition treaty between New York State and Britain. And so the first thing that had to be done was that any arrest of Muller had to be done under American law by an officer appointed by the US Marshal.
There was a lot of controversy in New York about what was going to happen to this prisoner when he was eventually arrested in New York.
Tanner waited and waited. Colleagues from London arrived on another boat with more paperwork for the extradition, but still there was no sign of Muller. The August heat in New York was punishing. Tanner and the other Englishmen sweltered in their rooms in the Everett House Hotel on 17th Street. They waited and wondered. Had Muller's ship been lost at sea? Had it been forced into another port? Might Muller escape them after all? With each day, Tanner's worries grew until, finally, on the 24th of August, the Victoria was spotted off the coast. It had been at sea almost 6 weeks. Tanner's long, stifling wait in New York was at an end. At last, the winds were carrying his quarry into port. Franz Muller was seized by American police before his ship had even docked. He flatly denied any involvement in the murder of Thomas Briggs. He never was on that train at all, he insisted. Now, a court in New York had to decide whether Detective Inspector Tanner had the evidence to prove otherwise.
Franz Muller was arrested, taken into custody, and he appeared before Mr. Newton, who was the commissioner at New York, who had this court hearing to decide whether Franz Muller was going to be extradited and sent back in custody to Britain to face trial.
There was a tremendous amount of sympathy for Muller from the immigrant community and hostility towards Britain, so it was going to be difficult.
The advantage that Tanner had was that extradition could be granted on the grounds that there was sufficient evidence to suggest there was a case to be answered. They stuck to that. They didn't try to defend the British cause. They didn't join in the emotionalism.
Mr. Newton decided that he should go back and agreed to the extradition request. If he hadn't done so, then Franz Muller would have been free to have been released, and he could have travelled anywhere in America. The chances of him being returned to face trial for the murder of Thomas Briggs would have been very remote.
With the extradition order secured on the 3rd of September, Tanner escorted Muller onto the steamship Etna. They left New York and America behind and set out once more into the Atlantic. The murder of Thomas Briggs had become a sensation in the British press. In Liverpool, a crowd awaited Muller's arrival. In the eyes of many, the young German was already guilty.
it was difficult to see that he would actually get a fair hearing. Such was the conviction among the general public that he was actually guilty of the murder.
The British public were intensely fascinated by the case because this was the first ever railway murder, and that was quite something. And the Fleet Street behemoth, the mass media, the biggest mass media the world had ever seen, there were literally 15 different morning papers. This was elixir to them.
What is interesting is that doubts begin to creep in. The presumptions of his guilt needed to be questioned.
Despite investigators' best efforts, they found no one who could place Muller at the scene of the crime. And there were at least 5 witnesses who spoke of seeing 2 other men in the compartment with Briggs, and neither matched the description of Franz Muller. But this information was not shared with the defense. The police were then under no obligation to do so. In 1864, the deck was stacked against the accused. There was no appeals court. The defendant was barred from giving evidence, and even his counsel was not allowed to sum up the defense to the jury at the end of the trial.
There was a German legal protection society that operated not only in London but also in New York, and they were concerned that actually as a German he was being discriminated against and perhaps being treated unfairly.
It had the feel rather of perhaps a show trial to some extent. They just wanted to rubber stamp what the court of public opinion had already found to have been guilty.
Franz Muller's trial began at the Old Bailey on the 27th of October 1864. 12 men would decide his fate. Over the next 3 days, they heard how the crushed beaver hat found in the blooded compartment matched one belonging to Muller. They heard about the hat he had with him in New York, which was silk and cut down in the crown to alter its height. And they heard how police discovered in Muller's luggage a piece of cloth sewn into a pouch and tied in a ribbon. Inside was Thomas Briggs' missing gold watch.
I have to say, it did look bad for Muller. He looked like the perfect part, on paper at least.
All the defence counsel could do was try and attack the prosecution's witnesses. Jonathan Matthew, the hansom cab driver, he was particularly savaged by defence counsel over a 21-day sentence that he'd served for a minor theft many, many years ago. Defence counsel was really clutching at straws.
There was sort of defence witness. One of them, or at least one of them, said that they thought that Thomas Briggs had been in the compartment with 2 men on that night.
The problem is that their witness testimony did not really make the impact that retrospectively it should have done.
The jury took just 15 minutes to make their decision. Muller was guilty. The judge donned the black cap and sentenced him to death. Early on the morning of the 14th of November, 1864, a gallows was erected outside Newgate Jail. Heavy rain was falling, but that didn't put off the crowds. They gathered in their tens of thousands to watch Franz Muller die. A few minutes before 8 o'clock, with the prison bell ringing, the condemned man was led out. The crowd roared as Muller, pale and trembling, climbed the scaffold. His legs were strapped, the noose placed around his neck, and a white hood pulled down over his face. Moments before the trapdoor gaped beneath his feet, the 24-year-old spoke in an urgent whisper to the German pastor beside him. Ich habe es getan, he said. Ich habe es allein getan. Ich habe keine Mitschuldigen. I did it. I did it alone. I have no accomplice. Then the trap door opened and Müller fell. After months of denying involvement in the crime, Müller had confessed. But mysteries remained. What actually happened in the first-class compartment that summer night? Had Müller planned the robbery, or did he act on impulse? Did he mean to kill Thomas Briggs by throwing him off the train? Or did the old man fall trying to escape?
I think the murder was very much a spur-of-the-moment thing. I mean, his man in his 60s looked an affluent man, and I think Müller just saw his opportunity.
He was carrying money in his wallet. He had a silk handkerchief, as well as his silk hat. He was carrying a briefcase, which was the type that bankers used to convey bullion or valuables in. I think he must have seemed a very tempting prospect.
It may well be that he saw the chance of snatching a gold watch and making the money and getting his way to America, but perhaps didn't realise that Thomas Briggs would have perhaps resisted so much.
There was a scuffle, and he ended up sort of thwacking this poor banker over the head with his stick. And you know, these things can happen very fast.
By modern standards, I don't think what took place in that carriage would count as murder. It would be manslaughter at most. The fatal injuries to Thomas Briggs happen as a result of him falling or being pushed out of the railway carriage.
The sensational murder of Thomas Briggs did nothing to slow the advance of the railways. Engines became more powerful, passengers more numerous. But as this technological boom grew and grew, so did the opportunities for the greedy and the violent. Franz Müller has gone down in British history as the first railway murderer. He would not be the last. The railways transformed Britain. From town to town and city to city, the tracks spread. They changed the way we live forever. But there was a darker side to the advent of the railways. This technological revolution offered new opportunities for the oldest of crimes. In this series, we'll be investigating the most notorious murders ever to take place on the British railways. Stories of the men who killed, of the police who hunted them, and of the victims who were left behind. From the files of Scotland Yard and the railway police, this is the history of blood on the tracks of Britain. From the moment he set eyes on her, he was obsessed. In 1878, Violet Cameron was just 15, but she was already a star on the London stage. To 18-year-old Percy Lefroy Mapleton, she was perfect. He was a poor and sickly young man. Violet didn't even know he existed. But Lefroy was convinced they belonged together. He would go to any lengths to win her. He would lie for her. He would steal for her. And eventually, he would kill for her.
This is a man who lives so much in a fantasy world that he has virtually no sense of reality until it's too late.
He's the eternal schoolboy. It's all fantasy and wish fulfillment. He creates a whole fictitious romance.
He had a sense of being invisible, perhaps, as he was growing up, and a need to make something of himself.
Percy Lefroy Mapleton dreamed of becoming a writer, and he could certainly tell a tall tale. He posed as a young man of education and wealth. He told some people he was related to an earl. He claimed his father had been a prominent clergyman. To others, he was Belgian nobility or a partner in a grand firm of solicitors. In fact, Lefroy's father was an alcoholic Royal Navy captain who showed no interest in his son, and his mother died of tuberculosis when he was just 6 years old.
He was sent to live with an aunt and his 2 cousins, and there he was brought up for the next 14 years.
His chest was weak, his health was weak, so he was always a concern to his family in a way that ensured that the consequences of his actions don't seem to have been brought home to him as part of his growing up. He seems always to have indulged in petty deceptions, petty lies, and to have got away with it.
Here is someone who was rather invisible as a child, was desperate to make a mark in a world that had seemed so hostile, at least in his early years.
By 1881, Lefroy's obsession with the young actress Violet Cameron was utterly consuming him. He told relatives they were married. He haunted the theatres where she performed, and he even found out where she lived and followed her when she went out.
Lefroy wanted to become a theatre critic, and I think this is when he suddenly spotted or conceived this passion for Violet Cameron.
She'd been on the stage since she was about 8. She was a popular singer, and she would perform in light-hearted operettas.
It was one of the few professions where women almost sort of rivaled men in terms of the celebrity status that they could achieve.
Percy Lefroy Mapleton longed for her to be in his life. So she's the star that he's fixed his hopes on, that he hopes by some kind of ploy and machination to attain.
If only he could find a way into Violet's world, present himself as a man of means, a man of talent, then surely she would see his worth. She would be his. Lefroy concocted an ambitious scam. In March 1881, he wrote to theatre newspaper The Era. In his letter, Lefroy announced the existence of an unpublished comic opera written by Jacques Offenbach. The popular French-German composer was in no position to deny Lefroy's claim. He had conveniently died the previous year. Lefroy used the fake opera as bait. He weaseled his way into a friendship with the Welsh tenor and theatre manager Henry Bracy. Lefroy promised Bracy exclusive rights to the opera and set about finding a composer to counterfeit the work. But then, in May 1881, Lefroy heard a sickening rumour. Violet, his Violet, was engaged.
She never ever met him. But he always seemed to think that he had actually declared his love and that she declared her love for him.
I don't think there can be any doubt that he was dangerously obsessed with the idea of somehow getting close to Violet Cameron.
Lefroy kept to his room by day. At night, he wandered the streets in a fog of jealousy and rage. Then he changed his plans. Lefroy told the tenor, Henry Bracy, that his wealthy benefactor had died. The Offenbach manuscript had been left to Lefroy, as well as £1,000 a year, and that would rise to £10,000 should Lefroy marry. He was convinced that Bracy could introduce him to Violet, and she would have no excuse to turn him down. There was just one problem. Lefroy could pose as a rich man. He fancied that he had the manners and the bearing, but he couldn't write an opera. He found a composer to forge it, but the man wanted £50. £50 Lefroy didn't have.
Tracy Lefroy Mapleton at that stage was presumably even more desperate than normal. He seemed to have run out of money completely.
He's put himself in a position where he needs to pay £50 to a composer if he's going to be able to produce anything, to be able to carry through his scheme, at least to meet Violet, even if it never gets staged. He's got money owing, he's got goods in pawn, and he has absolutely no legitimate income.
Lefroy despaired. He had promised Bracy the opera by July. He'd pawned his best clothes and owed money all over town. But then, a miracle. A friend who owed Lefroy 10 guineas promised to lend him £100. On the 24th of June, Lefroy met the man at Charing Cross Station. His friend cheerfully handed him a cheque, then dashed away to his train. Lefroy, giddy with excitement, hurried to the bank. But his friend had lied. The cheque was no good. There was no money. All Lefroy's promises and his grand plans came crashing down. In a matter of days, he would be exposed as a charlatan, and his dream of winning Violet's heart would crumble. He had to do something. On Monday the 27th of June, 1881, Percy Lefroy Mapleton woke late. He lived with his cousin Annie and her family in the town of Wallington, South London. He told them he worked as a journalist for the Era newspaper, but that was just another lie. His days were spent obsessing over the young actress Violet Cameron and scheming up ways to win her heart. Lefroy was desperate for money. His debts were growing. His opera scam was about to fall apart. But that Monday, he swore, was the day he would fix all that.
There is this crisis. He hasn't got the Offenbach script. He's in debt. He's pawning his clothes. He is a desperate man.
He thought somehow or other in his mind, perhaps, that if he could steal some money by some means or other, then his problems would be solved and he would move on to realise his ambitions.
I think it's a measure of just how deep his obsession was, that he doesn't seem to look beyond a desperate scheme to acquire money.
Just before 10 a.m., Lefroy called for his favourite nephew, Melville. He had an errand for the boy. He pressed a letter into the 7-year-old's hand and asked him to run it over to a nearby newsagent. Melville delivered the letter to Albert Ellis at his shop. It said that Melville's mother, the heavily pregnant Annie, had an order to place and asked Mr. Ellis to please call on them at once. After luring the newsagent away, Lefroy snuck out of the house and around the corner to the shop. He owed Ellis more than £1 and told the young assistant left in charge he wished to settle his bill. Lefroy handed the teenager an envelope telling him it had 2 sovereigns in it. The shop boy gave him 13 shillings in change. The teenager didn't open the envelope until Lefroy had left, and inside were a single shilling and 2 worthless antique medals. Having settled his debt and made a pretty profit doing so, Lefroy hurried away to Wallington Station. He caught the 10:49 train to London Bridge. It was time for the next part of his plan. He headed for Borough High Street. At number 25 stood the Adams and Hilstead pawnbrokers.
London was saturated with pawnbrokers at the time, and we need not think of this necessarily as something that was just for the destitute.
You pledge an article and you can borrow money against that article, and then when you've got the money back again, you can redeem it.
If the ticket wasn't redeemed at the declared time, then the pawnbroker would sell the items and make his profit that way.
The pawnbroker's function was there to enable you to keep up a facade of respectability. It's absolutely telling that the 2 busiest days for the pawnbroker were Saturday and Monday. You get your wages, you go, you redeem your Sunday best, you wear it out for whatever purpose, and then come Monday, you brush it down, make it look as respectable as you possibly can, and you return it to pawn.
Lefroy was a regular customer at the pawnbrokers. He'd pledged an overcoat there for 10 shillings. He'd got more than £1 for his dress suit, and he'd received another 5 shillings for a 6-chambered revolver. On the morning of the 27th of June, Lefroy came to get his pistol back.
Well, someone who was using pawn shops to quite the excessive degree that Lefroy was is suggestive of rather a roguish, shadowy figure.
We're not talking about lots of money, we're talking about 5 shillings or £1 or 10 shillings, tiny sums of money, all of which help him exist on a sort of a day-to-day basis.
It suggests someone who's on the margins of deprivation, who doesn't have a secure, solid, respectable, grounded existence, which is what the Victorians told people they should aspire to.
Lefroy returned to London Bridge. He bought a first-class ticket for Brighton. In the waiting room, under cover of a newspaper, he loaded his gun. It was nearly 2 o'clock. The Brighton Express train was getting ready to depart when Lefroy hurried down the platform.
They're all individual compartments in those days, so you couldn't get on at one part of the train and walk down the corridor to find who you were looking for.
He'd hoped to commit a robbery without violence, that simply waving the pistol in the face of some timid commuter would enable him to commit a robbery and get away with it. But it was so ill thought through.
He spotted a man sat alone in a first-class compartment. He was eating strawberries. Lefroy climbed in. 2 minutes later, the train pulled out of London Bridge Station. And soon, row after row of tightly packed streets were flashing by the window. But faced with the reality of what he had planned, Lefroy faltered. Every time he glanced at the man seemed to stare back. Lefroy grew nervous.
The man was looking at him in a peculiar way. Well, Percy Lefroy Mapleton was a bit odd himself.
Now, we know subsequently from other evidence that the man was George Austin. Now, Lefroy thinks from the man's stares that he knows that Lefroy is going to attack him, is going to kill him. He becomes frightened. What he doesn't know is that Austin is staring at him because Austin is incredibly short-sighted. And he's staring at him to try and focus, but Lefroy completely misinterprets it.
Lefroy could bear it no longer. At East Croydon, he got out. And further down the train, he saw another man sitting alone in another first-class compartment. He was dozing with a handkerchief over his head. Lefroy reboarded the train. This time, he told himself, he wouldn't hesitate. If dear Violet was to be his, now was the time for courage. The train accelerated to its top speed of 50 miles an hour. It whistled into the darkness of Merstham Tunnel. The train sped on south. Soon it rattled past the cottage of Anne Brown in Hawley. Through the windows of her front room, Mrs. Brown and her daughter had a clear view of the passengers inside.
According to the two women, they were watching the trains go by, just passing an idle hour.
They thought they saw two men fighting together in one of the compartments.
It's very difficult to know for certain, but I suspect that they at least saw something, the beginnings of an attack.
The train was soon approaching the outskirts of Brighton. At 3:20 p.m, it pulled into Preston Park Station, a mile and a half north of the town centre. And waiting on the platform was ticket collector Richard Gibson. As the train slowed, he saw a man leaning out of a first-class compartment, beckoning to him.
Immediately, he saw something wrong because he wasn't wearing a hat. All men wore hats. And not only did he have no hat, but he was covered in blood.
He was in a very physically shaken state. He was in a very mentally shaken state.
When they looked at him, they looked at his feet, and from his shoe, they could see that there was a gold chain. So the ticket collector pulled on the gold chain, and then came out a gold watch from his shoe. He said, "Well, what's this?" And Percy Lefroy Mapleton said, "Well, I don't know anything about this."
Later on, he claims that it was his watch and chain which he'd actually put into his shoe for safekeeping.
I think he was just in a state of shock, a state of panic, and he never subsequently achieved real clarity.
Another ticket collector and the station master gathered around Lefroy. He told the railwaymen that he'd been attacked on board, fired at 3 or 4 times, and struck over the head with a blunt instrument. The compartment was covered in blood. There were bullet holes in the cushions, there were bloody fingerprints on the footboard. But there was no sign of the man with the handkerchief. Percy Lefroy Mapleton was a good liar. He always had been. And now found blooded and bruised in a train compartment at Preston Park. He had quite the story to tell.
Initially, the railway staff are puzzled. They can't make any sense of Lefroy's story.
He says that he'd been attacked by 2 men, one a countryman and the other an old gentleman.
He very quickly changes his story so that the elderly gentleman isn't attacking him, it's only the countryman. The elderly gentleman sort of disappears, except that later on he reappears and the countryman disappears briefly, and it is the elderly gentleman who is attacking him.
They saw that he was obviously in a state, so the station master made sure that the ticket collector got back on the train with Percy Lefroy Mapleton, and they took him down the line to Brighton to the end. At Brighton, the police inspector started to question Percy Lefroy Mapleton and exactly what had happened.
As Lefroy was spinning his tale, 20 miles away, a railway platelayer was walking with his nephew through Balcombe Tunnel. Thomas Jennings was employed to inspect and maintain the tracks. With a naphtha lamp to light the way, Jennings walked the length of the soot-black tunnel, eyes peeled for any damage or obstruction. At around 4 p.m, he spotted something.
They saw a bundle, a heap, lying by the side of the track, and initially thought that something had been thrown out of a train window. They get closer and they realise it's a body.
He was obviously dead. They found some correspondence with his name on, and so they could identify him.
The dead man was Frederick Isaac Gold. He was 64 years old and lived with his wife Lydia just a few hundred yards from Preston Park Station. On the 27th of June, Gold had left home early and caught the 8:45 train from Brighton to London Bridge.
It was a regular trip that he took. He had retired to Preston Park. He had spent a long and successful career as a master baker. He'd had a series of shops that in his early 60s he'd sold off.
But he keeps one shop on because he looks on this as potentially as being something which he could hand on to his 14-year-old nephew.
He was not running it on a day-to-day basis, but he still maintained an interest. He was still the big boss. And so he would go up, check that things were well, inspect the takings, and take them home with him.
That morning, there were £38, 5 shillings and a penny. And Gold deposited the money at his bank in Whitechapel and prepared for the trip home. Just before 2 p.m, he took a seat in a first-class compartment on the Brighton Express. Two hours after Gold boarded the train in London, his body was found in Balcombe Tunnel. The fall from the train had inflicted terrible injuries. Gold's skull was crushed and his leg gashed open, but he'd been through an ordeal even before that. A bullet was found in his spine, and the doctors counted 14 different knife wounds on his body. It was clear Frederick Gold had suffered a vicious assault. But news of the discovery in the tunnel didn't reach Brighton immediately. There, police were wondering what to do with the strange young man who'd got off the train at Preston Park.
Because of his blood-stained appearance, they got him taken to hospital and cleaned up. And in fact, the doctors at the hospital sort of clarified that actually he only had very superficial scratches. He didn't have any serious injuries at all.
What they think is that Lefroy had expected to make away with himself in a state of temporary insanity and was still suffering from that.
They gave him to Detective Sergeant George Holmes to accompany back to his lodgings in Wallington.
Lefroy boarded the 6:10 train for London. When the train stopped at Balcombe Station, the detectives heard about the man found dead in the tunnel. But they didn't suspect Lefroy. At East Croydon, they received a telegram asking them to check the serial number of the watch spotted in Lefroy's shoe. The number Lefroy gave didn't match the watch. But still, the police did not suspect him.
The real mistake is made by Holmes, who has clearly been lulled into a sense of false security and doesn't take Lefroy seriously.
Thinking of him as a potential suicide, the police tended to treat him with sort of kid gloves, and they were quite sympathetic to him.
George Holmes knows that a dead body has been found, knows that Mapleton's possession of the watch is distinctly suspicious, but nevertheless carries on to Croydon with him, takes a cab and takes him to his address in Wallington.
After taking a written statement, the officer wished Lefroy a good night. The detective walked around the corner to Wallington Station. An urgent telegram was waiting for him there. It said Lefroy was not to be let out of his sight. The policeman hurried back to the house in Cathcart Road. He'd not been gone 10 minutes, but Percy Lefroy Mapleton had vanished.
The police investigation was completely bungled at this point.
It was pretty clear that he was the main murder suspect. He'd been effectively in police custody, and the police had let him go.
Police scoured the country for Lefroy. Detectives could find no photograph of their fugitive, and they relied instead on a drawing by the owner of the King's Arms in Carshalton. Lefroy had been a regular there, and the publican knew him well. The sketch found its way to the press. On the 1st of July, it was published in the Daily Telegraph.
This is the first time such a thing had been amplified by the full might of the British mass media, which was described around about the same time as the nerve centre of the world.
We know that in the first days after the publishing of the sketch, that it nearly sent the police pretty much across the country round the bend.
People thought they'd seen him or might have seen him all over the country, because remember, the Daily Telegraph had in London, it's read in the furthest flung pockets of the country.
One man was arrested on the mail train from Paddington to Devon, but it turned out not to be the right man. One man was arrested in Shoebury-Ness in Essex. Again, he was eliminated.
Anybody who broadly looked like Lefroy, or rather like that drawing, was likely to find himself being the focus of very much unwanted attention.
Lefroy was, in fact, still in London. After 3 days wandering the streets, he had found his way to a lodging house in Stepney. He pretended to be an engraver from Liverpool, newly arrived in the city. He kept to his room, barely venturing out. It wasn't the first time the 21-year-old had been on the run from the police. In 1878, he had posed as a theatrical manager and engaged a company of actors to perform a play in Gloucester. It seemed the 18-year-old Lefroy planned to abscond with the box office takings. But when the company arrived in Gloucester, Lefroy was nowhere to be found. The play never went ahead, and the furious actors began hounding Lefroy for compensation. When police began to take an interest in the affair, the young man decided a trip abroad was advisable for his health. In December 1878, he left for Australia.
Now, he's obviously made some money out of this scam, because a man who is generally short of cash gets on this boat to Australia and he's got some £40 in cash.
I don't think he's really got any practical plans beyond that.
By the time he reaches Australia, he's lost £7 of it. But he says he lands in Australia, he's got a good suit and £32 of cash. So for a time, he starts enjoying himself, goes to regattas, theatres, and he's enjoying himself and living quite comfortably. Then he suddenly realises that the money is running out.
Lefroy wired his family for more funds. Instead, they sent him a ticket home. By the end of September 1879, he was back in England. He'd scorned the chance of a new start.
He's out of the country for about 9.5 months. And 4.5 months of that he's in Australia. The rest of the time he's travelling backwards and forwards between Britain and Australia.
He's learned no lesson from that, except that actually people are willing to listen to a scheme that offers them the possibility of profit.
He returned to London and to his obsession with the young actress Violet Cameron. It was an obsession that would lead him to murder. But killing Frederick Gold had earned Lefroy little more than a few shillings and a gold watch. By the 7th of July, after 10 days a fugitive, he was growing desperate. He could not hide forever. He had to flee or face capture. He composed a telegram and asked his landlady to send it. It was a secret message to his cousin Frank. Percy Lefroy Mapleton was planning an escape. The telegram that arrived at the office of solicitor J.T. Hutchinson was a confusing one. It was from a man calling himself Mr. Clark and requested his wages be delivered to an address in Stepney that evening. But nobody by that name worked at the office. And the last line of the telegram was even more baffling. Flower tomorrow, not 33. The telegram was intended for Frank Seal. Seal was a general copying clerk at the solicitor's office. He was also Percy Lefroy Mapleton's cousin.
I think he's decided that he's not cut out for robbery, so he has to try something else.
This is a sort of a desperate way of trying to get in touch with Frank for him to come and see him and help him out with some money.
But if the telegram contained a coded cry for help, Seal didn't understand it. Lefroy's desperate gambit would only succeed in bringing the police straight to his door. The landlady at Lefroy's lodging house in Stepney had grown suspicious of her tenant, and on the 8th of July she sent her daughter to J.T. Hutchinson's to find out more about the mysterious newcomer.
She's told that nobody of that name works there, but she then gets chatting with one of the clerks and tells the clerk of her mother's suspicions about their lodger. The clerk quickly realises who she's talking about, that it's Lefroy. And so that evening, after work, he goes to Scotland Yard, tells them where they can find Lefroy, and he gets the £200 reward.
At 7:45 on the evening of the 8th of July, a cab pulled up outside the Stepney lodging house. Inside were 3 policemen. One guarded the front of the house, one the back, and one went inside. Percy Lefroy Mapleton was sat in his room upstairs. He denied the murder, but did not resist arrest. The manhunt was over.
He was tracked down because of his desperation for money, more than anything else.
Scotland Yard eventually arrested Percy Mapleton 10 days after the murder, and he was put on trial down at Maidstone Assizes.
Lefroy's trial began on Friday the 4th of November 1881. Lefroy told another version of the story he'd first told the ticket inspectors at Preston Park. He was innocent. He'd been attacked by a mysterious countryman who robbed and murdered Frederick Gold, stuffed Mr. Gold's watch in Lefroy's shoe, and then jumped off a speeding train, never to be seen again. It was not a compelling defense.
The defence could have argued for insanity, but because of Lefroy's insistence on the third person being in the coach, such a defence is impossible. It can't be argued.
Montague Williams, his defence counsel, commented that any time that he saw journalists paying attention to him, he seemed to preen, to respond. What he had attempted to do before appearing in the dock was redeem his evening clothes from pawn. He wanted to turn up in full evening dress in the dock.
He thought this would impress the jury. What he was allowed to have was his silk hat, which he had kept on the ledge in front of him, and he would often be toying with that or turning it and looking at it.
He spends much of the trial focusing on that, almost to the exclusion of anything else. He spends very little time responding to what is going on around him.
Lefroy was so convinced his story would be believed, he'd booked a cab to whisk him away after his acquittal. But the jury didn't share his delusions. After just 10 minutes deliberation, they returned to court with a verdict of guilty. Lefroy was sentenced to death. Before he was taken away, he turned to the jury. "Someday, when too late," he said, "you will learn that you have murdered me." He was taken from Maidstone Crown Court to the prison in Lewes, and it was there he would face execution. Lefroy had 3 weeks to live. At first, it seems he still believed he might escape his fate. He clung to his story about the murderous countryman. Then he tried to confess to another killing, hoping an investigation might postpone his execution. But the authorities dismissed his claims, as they did his solicitor's plea of insanity. As the end drew near, Lefroy looked back at his short and eventful life. He began to write.
The autobiography that Lefroy wrote in prison is rather a bizarre but quite mesmerizing blend of fact, fiction, fantasy, outright lies, and earnest confession.
He describes his emotions, his sensations. He describes how he came to the desperate and horrid conclusion that he had no choice but robbery. He makes himself almost the hero of an adventure story.
He's packed his sentences full of drama, and it was beautifully overwritten and colourful and garish and sort of leapt out at you. He's still trying to leave a legacy, still trying to have some kind of monument to what had become, sadly, rather a pitiful and murderous existence.
In high-flown language, Lefroy told his story, a tangle of fact and fantasy that is hard even now to unravel. But he made one thing clear. He did kill Frederick Gold.
He said that he had been trying to steal some money. Frederick Gold had put his handkerchief over his head and fallen asleep, and his purse had fallen down on the floor. And he could see there were some coins there. And he'd been tempted to pick them up, but as soon as he moved, Frederick Gold immediately jumped up and accused him of trying to steal his purse and his money from the floor.
He indicates that he only turned to murder when Gold fought back, when he was taken by surprise.
And he blurs the actual moment of Mr. Gold's disappearance out of the carriage. When the door opens, there is darkness, a scream, a yell. It conjures up the atmosphere, but we've not got specific details.
It showed absolutely no moral consciousness of having done something wrong. And it's that aspect which really strongly comes across in the autobiography, that he is not sorry for what he has done.
Percy Lefroy Mapleton murdered Frederick Gold, and he did it for Violet Cameron. His obsession with the famous actress remained undimmed, and from his condemned cell he wrote to her. Soon he was telling his solicitor that she'd written back. Violet had forgiven him, he said, and even enclosed flowers for the poor doomed man. The actress, of course, had done no such thing. Her only response to Lefroy came in a letter to the Daily Telegraph. She had never met him or exchanged words with him. She had no idea who he was. His delusions had made a thief of Percy Lefroy Mapleton. They had made him a murderer. And on the morning of the 29th of November, 1881, they carried him to the gallows. The railways transformed Britain. From town to town and city to city, the tracks spread. They changed the way we live forever. But there was a darker side to the advent of the railways. This technological revolution offered new opportunities for the oldest of crimes. In this series, we'll be investigating the most notorious murders ever to take place on the British railways. Stories of the men who killed, of the police who hunted them, and of the victims who were left behind. From the files of Scotland Yard and the railway police, this is the history of blood on the tracks of Britain. It was the evening of Sunday, the 29th of September, 1895. Detective Constable William Henry Osborne waited on the platform at Wigan North West Station. The 8 o'clock train from Manchester was due, and Osborne was expecting someone. For 2 months, the 33-year-old railway police officer had been watching the goods yard at Wigan. Night after night, a gang of thieves had targeted the wagons there, cutting through cords and sheets and making off with whatever they could carry. Osborne hadn't been able to stop them, but tonight would be different.
The murder was actually quite an important and traumatic event. He was the first police officer for the London North West Railway Company to lose his life in the execution of his duty.
This is something that affects not just the people immediately involved and their families, but the wider community. All of a sudden, you are in territory which you've never bargained for.
Osborne could hear the familiar chug of the approaching engine. He peered into the darkness. Billowing smoke and steam revealed the train coming round the bend. It was carrying another detective employed by the London and North Western Railway. With his colleagues' help, Osborne hoped his luck would change. The train jolted to a halt. Osborne raised his hand as 37-year-old Detective Sergeant Robert Kidd stepped down onto the platform. Kidd was well known on the force, an experienced police officer, a man who knew his business. Osborne smiled. Yes, he was sure. Tonight would be different. Earlier that same evening, less than half a mile from Wigan Northwest Station, 4 friends had met for a drink in the New Inn on Warrington Road. William Halliwell was 31. He was a coal miner, as were the others with him. 2 half-brothers, Elijah Winstanley and Bill Kearsley. The men's work was exhausting, filthy, and dangerous.
You're looking at very long shifts. You're looking at days that start first thing in the morning and then go on for a good 12 hours.
The inhalation of coal dust meant that by the early 20s, men's lungs were completely mottled. By the time they reached their 60s, should they reach their 60s, then their lungs were coal black.
The miners had to dig out the coal very often by hand, a lot of hard manual labour underground, a very difficult, dark, dangerous job.
The miners faced flooding. There was a danger of roofs collapsing, props breaking. So there was a tremendous amount of danger.
The mining was particularly dangerous because they're mining something called cannel coal, which is very gassy. So there's a real danger of explosions.
William Halliwell worked in one of the hundreds of pits that surrounded Wigan. It was a town transformed by the Industrial Revolution. In 1800, it had been a small market town of just 10,000 inhabitants. But by the end of the century, its population had grown 5-fold. As well as collieries, there were brick factories, breweries, ironworks, and mills. Smoke choked the town's air and blackened its stones.
Within a 90-mile radius of Wigan, there were some 1,000 coal pits, and this all contributed to the wealth and expansion of the town. By 1820, the town was gaslit. It had its own public park, its own library.
Wigan is a long-established coal town. More recently, it developed into a cotton town, and then, more recently still, into a railway town.
Wigan was the place between Manchester, Liverpool. It was on a good position to act as something of a transport hub.
It's crowded, it's busy, there's a lot of speculative building, a lot of speculative enterprises going on in Wigan. It's a small-time boom town, maybe, but very definitely a boom town.
To the south of the town, in the shadow of the railway line, stood a terrace of tiny cottages, Kay's houses.
They are basically slum housing, and not that good slum housing, even so.
There would be 2 rooms up, 2 rooms down for each one, and they were actually shared typically by 2 families.
The families there are either related directly and closely by blood or by long-standing community familial feeling.
William Halliwell lived at number 6, Bill Kearsley at number 2, and Elijah Winstanley at number 22. Halliwell and his wife had 4 living children, all under the age of 10. and this was by no means unusual. Winstanley had 5 children. The older man, Kearsley, had 9. A lot of mouths to feed.
Your life could be extremely hard. Some miners lived a poor and a precarious existence with overcrowded housing, poor housing, and uncertain incomes.
The houses and their livings were all revolved around the coal mine. For the men, there was little to fall back on, and if they had no employment in the coal mine, then work elsewhere was very, very difficult.
It was hard physical work. There was always the possibility of industrial accidents or people simply injuring themselves.
In 1893, after a fall in coal prices, pit owners had demanded a 25% cut in wages. Miners across the country went on strike. At the Acton Hall colliery in Yorkshire, troops were deployed. 2 miners were shot dead. The strike was finally settled by less violent government intervention. A conciliation board was set up with representatives from both sides. Miners returned to work, initially on their old salary, before agreeing to a 10% cut in 1894.
There was a decline in demand for English coal, and in particular for the kinds of coal that were being mined in Lancashire.
The miners wanted better working conditions, better housing, better living conditions. This would have cut into the owners' profits.
So, while officially sorted, relations between mine owners and miners were not good in 1895.
For men like William Halliwell in Wigan, it was always a stretch to make ends meet. But there was usually a penny or two spare for a beer on a Sunday evening. On the 29th of September 1895, Halliwell and his friends had finished their drinks at the New Inn just after 7 in the evening. They were heading, they loudly declared, to another pub they liked, the Fox Tavern on Chapel Lane. The men walked down the Warrington Road and cut over the fields. The moon was almost full, and they could see their way clearly as they crossed the waste ground and passed under the railway. They could go straight on over another field and across a footbridge to reach the pub, but they didn't do that. To their left was the dilapidated terrace known locally as Kay's Houses. This was where they met the others. The men were not going to another pub that night. They had a different destination in mind. There were police on the railways in Britain from the very beginning. By 1826, the Stockton and Darlington Railway employed a superintendent and 4 regular officers. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which opened in 1830, had a policeman stationed at every mile along the track. But the duties of these early railway police had little to do with crime.
The early railway police have no community responsibility. They are answerable solely to the companies that set up the various forces.
The early role of the transport police was the safety of the railways. This meant policemen patrolling the tracks, making sure there are no obstructions on the track.
When railways were first established, the railway engines that pulled the trains weren't always very reliable. Sometimes the boilers blew up, the technology wasn't very good. There was no signalling system either. They had to make sure that there was no accidents and it was properly organised. So in the very early days, the railway companies employed constables for controlling the rail traffic.
Mechanical signalling and the electric telegraph put an end to that. No more would policemen be guiding trains with flags and hand signals, but there was still plenty for them to do on Britain's growing railway network. The Carriers Act of 1830 had made railway companies legally responsible for the goods they transported. Compensation had to be paid in the event of loss or theft.
From the start, the railways provided new opportunities for old style of crime.
It was all very petty stuff. It wasn't major crime that the transport police were dealing with.
The companies needed to make sure that the goods that they carried were safe, because their profits depended on not losing so much in the way of goods that people would not use their services to transport their goods.
By 1850, the London and North Western Railway employed more than 700 constables on their lines. In 1863, they formed their own detective department, and 32 years later, William Henry Osborne was one of them. He'd been stationed at Holyhead and Salford after that, and in early 1895 he was sent to Wigan.
His job was really to detect offences when they happened. Sometimes it was employees of the railway company, sometimes it was the passengers.
There were always people who wanted to cheat the railway company of their fares, travelling first class on a third class ticket, say, things like that, worried the companies.
There was an engine driver who had stolen a crate of whiskey, for instance. There was a drunken chef who'd caused troubles, who had to be arrested.
He has to deal with recalcitrant passengers, with odd brawls on the railway. The most regular duty he seems to have had was trying to police the goods siding at Wigan.
These railway trucks were in the sidings, unattended, and for a number of weeks they'd been pilfering.
The railway companies were trying to do this on the cheap. It was cheaper to pay for a couple of railway detectives than to put up really secure fencing and other precautions around the goods yards.
The wagons were left overnight from Saturday until Monday morning, so Sunday was the prime time for thieving to take place in the goods yard.
Railway companies generally accepted a steady level of pilfering so long as it was small. When it became too regular and too sizable, then the complaints of customers were likely to mean that the company felt that it had to do something. And at Wigan, the level of pilfering had reached a level that was of real concern to the railway company.
On the night of the 29th of September, Osborne and a second railway detective, a sergeant named Robert Kidd, had been ordered to keep watch over the goods yard. In plain clothes, they walked south along the track from Wigan North West Station. The line was elevated above the town. Lamplighters were at their work below, tracing the streets in flame, mapping out the darkness. If he'd wanted to, Osborne could have looked to his right and picked out home, a few hundred yards away on Hodson Street. His youngest child, Elsie, had just turned 1, and his wife, Sarah, was probably rocking her to sleep. There were no gas lamps here on the railway, but the moon was bright that night. Osborne peered over the wall beside the line, down into the goods yard.
The railway sidings at Wigan were used for storing sort of goods trucks when they were being shunted and put into different trains to be taken off to Liverpool, Manchester or to the north.
The goods were covered by tarpaulins tied down with rope or string, and so it was an easy matter to cut the cord, cut the string, roll back the tarpaulin, and then take what was available, or some of what was available, inside the wagons.
Osborne couldn't see anyone in the yard. He and Detective Sergeant Kidd continued down the track to the end of the wall. Crouching there was a man. "Hello, what do you want?" said Osborne. The man shot up. "Hi up, lads, have you got it?" he called, and sprang away into the yard. Osborne and Kidd rushed after him. The detectives rounded the corner. 5 or 6 other men scattered into the darkness. Kidd bolted after them as Osborne leapt onto the first man they'd seen.
He seems to have tackled the man as he tried to run away. Man who's distinctly fit, fights back, and fights back hard.
There was a lot of punching and kicking and rolling around on the ground.
Meantime, his colleague had chased after other people who were also involved in the stealing.
Osborne couldn't see what was happening, but there was obviously this fight going on.
All of a sudden, as Henry Osborne was really getting control of this man, a second man came up and kicked him in the shins, and then a third man came up and he could see a knife.
It shone like glass in the moonlight. Osborne barely had time to get to his feet. He couldn't even grab his truncheon properly. Instead, he swung it by the leather strap. It whipped through the air, smashing into the advancing man's hand. With a yelp of pain, he fell back. The 2 newcomers scattered. Osborne tried to give chase, but already limping, soon fell behind. He turned back to the first man, grappling with him once again as he tried to make his escape.
The original man had gathered strength. He actually took Osborne's truncheon from him, hit him with the truncheon, and knocked him senseless.
He seems to have managed to wrench the truncheon away from Osborne and hit him over the head with it, giving him concussion and taking advantage of his dazed condition to escape.
All the thieves had escaped. Osborne limped back to the goods yard. And by the wall, he saw Detective Kidd.
It's a bright moonlight night, and it's sufficient for Osborne to see that Kidd is bleeding, and bleeding badly.
Kidd was on his hands and knees, and Osborne said that he could hear sort of blood falling. Kidd said, "Is that you, Osborne? Could you give me something to drink? I'm thirsty." Osborne could do very little to help him.
Osborne tried to lift Kidd. The injured man hung loosely from his arms. Osborne could feel the blood running out of him. He managed a few stumbling steps, maybe 10 yards at most. Then William Henry Osborne collapsed. The fight with the railway detective had left William Halliwell bruised and exhausted. He could feel his left eye swelling already, and his leg throbbed from where the policeman had hit him with the truncheon. Halliwell had been keeping watch in the goods yard, while others went to see what could be had from the wagons.
They'd actually gone into the goods yards to steal a bag of coal. What they'd actually taken was a jar of sweets and 3 tins of condensed milk.
Very different from today, where we're used to having metal containers that are very secure. These railway trucks, they'd be very often open trucks, covered in tarpaulin or some other covering, and they'd either be roped down or even sometimes with fairly strong string.
The goods yards are very, very poorly secured. It's easy enough in the very large number of wagons to sneak up, to sneak in, to target a wagon or 2 wagons and get away with a profitable handful of goods.
Halliwell had not been on watch 15 minutes when the 2 policemen arrived. He struggled to piece together what had happened after that. He was fighting the first policeman, scrambling over the hard ground, but he had no idea what his friends had been up to until they rushed out of the darkness to join him. Halliwell knew they had to get their stories straight. He had to find the others before the police did. Luckily, he knew where he might find them. The Fox Tavern stood on the corner of Chapel Lane and Bridge Street. Halliwell stepped through the door at around 9:30. Almost an hour had passed since the fight at the goods yard, and there was Elijah Winstanley with a drink in his hand.
They discussed what had actually happened. Halliwell said that he'd been hit about the head by Osborne and he'd been punched and kicked. But Winstanley said that he'd actually stabbed Kidd several times.
Winstanley is reported to have said that he didn't think that the man he'd stabbed would survive.
That puts things on an entirely different footing for Halliwell. Halliwell has been very probably involved in pilfering before. This is the business of the magistrates' courts. And in the magistrates' courts, 4/5 of all prison sentences are for a month or less. All of a sudden, he's involved in something that is an indictable offence. And I think he starts panicking from that moment.
As Halliwell and Winstanley drank, the investigation into what had happened in the goods yard was already underway. William Henry Osborne had managed to crawl to a signal box and get help. An engine was sent down the line. They assumed there had been an accident, that the detectives had been hit by a train. It was only when they brought Kidd's body back to the station that it became clear what had happened.
The doctor was called, but it was too late. He'd lost an awful lot of blood and he'd actually died.
Part of a finger was missing. He'd been stabbed in the neck and the face and the head.
9 wounds were counted. The jugular was affected, the windpipe was affected. The identifiable deep stab wounds elsewhere to the head were an indication of a frenzied assault.
At the post-mortem, the doctor said that some of the injuries could only have been inflicted if Kidd was unconscious or had been held by somebody other than the person doing the stabbing.
Robert Kidd was the first railway policeman to be murdered on duty. The 37-year-old had been married with 7 young children. He'd been on the city force in Manchester before joining the London and North Western Railway in 1885. He was a well-liked and respected officer. Investigators had a strong suspicion where the culprits for his murder might be found.
There was no real evidence apart from what William Osborne could tell them. They really ended up going by their instincts in where the suspects were most likely to be.
The mass raid on Kay's houses was almost inevitable because so many of the men living in the houses had got convictions for stealing from the wagons.
They were simply on the balance of probabilities convinced that one or all of the culprits were going to be found in that location.
The police went from door to door. At number 2, they found Bill Kearsley in his bed. He had several cuts and scratches on his hands and face. Kearsley was well known to police. He had 2 convictions, one for stealing books, another for assaulting a gamekeeper while out night poaching. He was arrested, told to get dressed, and taken to Wigan Police Station.
Kearsley is an interesting character. He very clearly had, I suppose, what you could call charm. He seems to have been widely liked, and the mere fact that Kersley is whistling, sitting on his step in his shirt sleeves and going, "I know nothing," is going to cut no ice. He is the person who they are most likely to suspect of having been involved.
They took him to the hospital where William Osborne was a patient. The doctors said he was fit enough to try and identify them, so they actually put him on an identification parade at the hospital, and he picked out Bill Kersley as the man who'd kicked him in the shins.
When more men returned to Kay's houses throughout the night, the police were waiting for them. They arrested Richard Pritchard and a nephew of Kersley's named David Millington. Later they caught Ralph Birchall, James Wellens, and another of Kersley's half-brothers, James Winstanley. But there was no sign of Elijah, who lived at number 22, nor of William Halliwell from number 6. Halliwell had seen the police going house to house. He'd snuck away while he had the chance and passed the night sleeping on a barge. He waited until Tuesday when he was sure the police had left before daring to come home. But it was a ruse.
What the police did, they made a pretense of all the uniformed officers withdrawing from Kay's houses and pretended, in fact, that they had finished their inquiries. But they left a couple of officers in plain clothes behind, hiding, and then, sure enough, Halliwell reappeared a few hours later.
The fact that he'd gone home thinking he was safe, thinking he had got away with it, was something which rocked him off balance, which helps to explain the events which subsequently unfold.
Late that evening, police finally arrested Elijah Winstanley. He was taken to the Wigan Infirmary, where the injured Detective Constable Osborne picked him out of a lineup. 8 men had now been arrested. On Thursday, the 3rd of October, they were brought up at the Borough Police Court. Detectives suspected that all of them had been there that night, but there was no evidence against 5, so they had to be released. Only Elijah Winstanley, Bill Kersley, and William Halliwell were kept in custody. The 3 miners faced the charge of murder.
There is evidence to show that the pilfering expedition was on a rather grander scale than was actually proceeded with.
The police had to put a sense of priorities because it was more important to convict the murderer.
The railway company chose not to offer any evidence against another 5 or possibly 6 men who were initially suspected of involvement in the pilfering expedition on the goods siding.
But the case against Winstanley and Kersley was only circumstantial. Nobody had witnessed what had happened behind the wagons. Nobody could say who might have wielded the knife or who might have held the policeman down. If anyone were to be convicted for the murder, police would need more evidence. So, Superintendent Robert McIntosh of the Wigan Police sat down with Halliwell. It was time the 2 of them had a little chat.
Superintendent McIntosh, who was leading the investigation, told Halliwell that if he gave evidence against Kersley and Winstanley, that he would go free.
Halliwell, I suspect, is the one who seems the most vulnerable. McIntosh may well have said something to him along the lines of, "If you confess, my lad, it will go much easier on you."
If Halliwell refused, he could receive a long jail sentence or worse. That would be disastrous for his family. They relied on him. on his wage from the pit. Without it, they would sink into even deeper poverty. Halliwell's youngest son was not yet 1. He would not survive such hardship. Halliwell had a choice. He could save himself and his family. But that would mean sending 2 of his closest friends to the gallows. William Halliwell had been one of a gang of men. They had gone to the goods yard at Wigan on the 29th of September 1895, the night that Detective Sergeant Robert Kidd died. One of the others, Elijah Winstanley, had already confessed to the murder. At the magistrate's hearing, he'd screamed from the dock, "I did it! Kill me! Kill me!" But the third man charged, Winstanley's half-brother, Bill Kearsley, still insisted on his innocence. He wasn't there when Kidd died, he said. He had run away. Only the word of his friend, William Halliwell, could contradict him.
By the time that the case is remanded to the assizes by the magistrates in the middle of October, it's fairly clear that Winstanley is understood as the killer of Robert Kidd. The question is how far William Kearsley is involved.
Halliwell's evidence was vital to the prosecution case if they were to convict Kearsley as well as Winstanley.
Halliwell had known Bill Kearsley for many years. It was a close-knit community, they lived close by. So actually it was very difficult for him. It became a matter of life or death.
The trial began in the imposing setting of St George's Hall, Liverpool, on the 26th of November. Kearsley and Winstanley were tried for the murder of Detective Sergeant Kidd. Halliwell faced the lesser charge of causing grievous bodily harm to Detective Constable Osborne.
It was already public knowledge from the newspapers that he in turn informant against Kearsley and Winstanley, obviously to save his life.
I think from the time that he had met Winstanley in the Fox Inn, Halliwell was on edge, upset.
The newspaper report sort of says that actually he was a bit of a shadow of the man he had been a few weeks beforehand because of the stress of the trial.
He knows that the evidence he is going to give linking Kearsley and Winstanley to the murder of Robert Kidd is likely to send one, if not both men, to the gallows.
The stress of it all had taken its toll on Halliwell. He looked ill as he entered the box. He gave his version of what happened that night in the yard. He told the court that both Winstanley and Kearsley had been with him in the Fox Tavern afterwards. That Winstanley had said he stabbed Robert Kidd, and that Bill Kearsley had held the policeman down while he did it. As soon as Halliwell spoke those words, he crashed unconscious out of the witness box. Halliwell was removed from court, and when he'd recovered, he returned to the witness box. He was asked to repeat what he'd said. Halliwell did so in a whimper, then leaned his head on the edge of the witness box and cried.
There was little or no other evidence against Kearsley other than Halliwell's evidence.
It is actually the thing that convinces me that he was accurate, that in some way Kearsley was actually involved in the attack on Kidd.
Halliwell seems to have been beefing up the evidence against Kearsley by saying that he was present in the pub when Winstanley admitted stabbing Robert Kidd several times. According to the landlord of the pub, Winstanley and Halliwell were in the pub on their own. Kearsley, there is evidence to show that he was actually at home, where he was actually seen by one of the policemen carrying out the investigation.
It seems fairly clear that the extent of the injuries is most reasonably, most logically explained by somebody else being involved and in some way holding Kidd down. But to do that, to betray your friend, your close colleague, your worker, is not going to have been easy.
The defence called no witnesses. By the afternoon, the judge was already summing up the case and asking the jurors for their verdict. Without even leaving their seats, the 12 men came to a decision. Elijah Winstanley and Bill Kearsley were guilty. They were sentenced to death. The following day, the charge against Halliwell was dismissed. He was free to go. Halliwell could return to his family in Wigan. The others, it seemed, faced certain execution. But then began an extraordinary campaign to save the life of Bill Kearsley.
The petition in favour of Kearsley being given a pardon was prompted when Winstanley burst out and told the court that he alone was guilty of the murder, that Kearsley was not present. The jury said that had they had that evidence, they would not have convicted Kearsley of the murder.
There was a lot of local community feeling that perhaps Bill Kearsley certainly wasn't as guilty as Elijah Winstanley, and so there was a lot of sympathy for his position.
Petitions after convictions at the assizes were by this time commonplace. It's very difficult to find a murder conviction where there is not at least one petition.
There was no court of criminal appeal, so nothing could be done about the conviction. It was only the Home Secretary who could do anything about that.
On the 10th of December, the Home Secretary made his decision. There was no reprieve for Elijah Winstanley. The 29-year-old was hanged at Liverpool's Walton Prison on the 17th of December 1895. He left behind a wife and 5 young children. But his half-brother was spared. Bill Kearsley's sentence was commuted to hard labour. He was released from Dartmoor Prison in 1903. He returned home to Wigan and found employment at a steelworks.
Kearsley returns to his community, but interestingly, he returns a changed man. He has reformed and become a teetotaler. So when his erstwhile friends offer to buy him drinks, one of the most striking things about his return is that he says no.
In Kearsley's case, there was a great sense of feeling among the public that he had been unjustly convicted of the murder of Robert Kidd. And so there was a lot of sympathy for his situation, especially as Winstanley had stressed all along that only he was involved in the murder.
In the years after the murder, Detective Constable William Henry Osborne left the railway police, but not the railways. He became a fireman and remained one until his retirement. He died in 1928. William Halliwell remained a coal miner, though he moved away from Kay's houses and the community there. His decision to turn Queen's evidence may have saved his family from the workhouse, but times were still hard. A few weeks after Winstanley's execution, pit owners demanded another 10% cut in miners' wages. The conciliation board, set up after the 1893 strike, collapsed. For men like Halliwell and their families, life became even more precarious. At the dawn of the 20th century, the fight over conditions and wages for men working underground had only just begun.